Peter Hitchens is here. Very good morning to you, I should say.
Good morning,
Wishing
I hope.
the day away. Yeah, what a beautiful day it's turned out to be after the rain of this morning.
Loveliest time of the year.
I mean, you cycle a lot, but I'm always encouraged when it rains because hardly anybody cycles.
And you think of me getting wet?
No, not you, because I like you. And it's only these sort of fair weather cyclists. There's a guy that works at Virgin who comes in, day out. He said, this is my weather for cycling, because he says all the fair weather cyclists get out of the way. They don't bother coming out.
It's true.
And I mean, it is very true. But now it's a beautiful day. The skies have cleared for you.
No, this is the loveliest time of the year.
I do like autumn, I must say.
It's energy returns, and it's
and the
I don't know
mugginess.
why people don't like it more.
The
much nicer than the
disappears.
summer, boring, humid, flaccid time.
You're supposed to go to other places for that sort of weather, aren't you? Let's talk about your column this week. You wrote about Liz Truss and how ludicrous it was, one, to boast about having a comprehensive education, but also then to point out that some of her stories seem to be slightly how should we put it? It's not recollected quite as well as they might have been.
Well, there we are. People do suffer from. All of us, I think, suffer from distorted recollections.
I thought I went to a terrible school, for example.
Well, I remember we had an encounter on Question Time back in 2013, and she was saying, "Oh, I went to a comprehensive school and it was very ordinary and average." And I said, "What, in Roundhay?" Because I know a bit about Leeds. I know Roundhay is a pretty affluent part of Leeds, not totally.
And Leeds is a pretty wealthy city in places.
A lot of Leeds is wealthy. Yeah. It's by no means a poverty-stricken part of the north.
No.
But the thing was that she said it was average, and she keeps on saying this. But of course, like almost all the comprehensive schools attended by the middle class, particularly the educated and the well-off middle class, it was much superior to the bog standard schools on the other side of town.
Yeah.
And although it was nothing like as good as the old grammar schools, the pre-1965 grammar schools used to be, because they were superb.
Yeah.
It's a good deal better than what you would normally otherwise get, and she got to Oxford from it. And it's a really peculiar thing that Tory politicians have taken to doing. Theresa May actually went to a grammar school which became a comprehensive while she was there.
Right.
And she always put in reference books that it was a comprehensive school without mentioning the grammar period. Which is, again, was odd. Why is it? I think you can see why Labour is still wildly committed to comprehensive education. There was one Labour MP, who I won't name, who actually used to put in his Who's Who entry that he went to a comprehensive school before comprehensive schools were even invented.
It's a sort of reverse snobbery,
he was so keen to have been to one that he actually.
But it's a sort of reverse snobbery, isn't it?
It's worse than that. It's a wild dogma. And there was a great belief in the 40s and 50s among a lot of left-wing people that if we had common schools, as they called them, that everybody went to, it would be a social revolution in society, and also education would be better. And they didn't really have any evidence to back this up, and they went ahead without any elaborate plans or research. They just did it, and very quickly it turned out to be wrong. The comprehensives were, first of all, they were class biased because they were area based, and if you lived in an expensive part of town, you went to a better school. Which is nobody's idea of it seems to me, of undermining privilege. In fact, it reinforces privilege. And then the results began to sag. In fact, the old GCE O-level, which you probably remember, was first of all watered down and then abolished because the comprehensives simply couldn't cope with it, whereas the grammar schools found to dawdle. And interestingly, a lot of the much maligned secondary modern schools were taking O-levels very successfully.
Right.
They
used to have O-levels and CSEs, I think.
They did, but the CSEs weren't very satisfactory.
No.
Nobody much liked them. Employers weren't keen on them. But a lot of the secondary moderns were taking quite large numbers of O-levels. And this is a forgotten part of our history. Some of them were also taking A-levels. Many of them would send their pupils over to the nearby grammar school to complete A-level courses. And it's a fascinating part of this debate that for many, many years people said, so the grammar schools may have been all right, but the secondary moderns were terrible. But one of the very few bits of research which was done by John Marks and Baroness Cox in, I think, 1983-ish, on exam results from secondary moderns and grammar schools as compared with comprehensives, which at that stage still coexisted, suggested that the secondary moderns were actually doing better than the comps. So if that's so, and there was fury at this, the Department of Education absolutely exploded with rage and tried to discredit the report. And a huge fuss, and in the end, Sir Keith Joseph, who was then Education Secretary,
remember him,
had to come to Parliament and say that the report was valid.
Goodness me.
He had to defend the report against his own civil servants. It's extraordinary. It's forgotten now. But that was probably the only piece of direct comparative research ever done between comprehensives and their predecessors.
And comprehensives
didn't look good for them, and ever since then examinations have been watered down.
Yeah, and comprehensives were the beginning really of the kind of the dumbing down of the education system, weren't they? Because they had to kind of find the lowest point and teach everybody at that level.
They were in the form they took. Some of the early comprehensives were very good. They had excellent headmasters, and they continued to have honours boards and teachers in gowns and assemblies in the morning and discipline. You found it very hard to tell them from grammar schools. Very quickly, the ethos of the age ate away at that, and they introduced mixed ability teaching, and got rid of streaming, and in general became much more comprehensive. And of course, the middle classes fled from those schools and went to the ones in better areas. But
or they went private. I think a lot more people went private in that case as well.
They did. That had been going on for some time because the grammar schools have been getting harder to get into because of the population bulge. I mean, I've written a book about this. I'm horribly expert on it. So
that's good.
So Michael Gove wouldn't approve of me, but I am.
I think Michael Gove stopped talking to me. I'm not quite sure.
The fascinating thing is that the Tory party was never the friend of the grammar schools. While they still existed, it built very few, it did little to defend them, and when they started being destroyed, in fact, it was Margaret Thatcher as a Tory Education Secretary who signed off on the closure of more grammar schools than any Labour minister.
And she did go to one, didn't she?
She very much did, yes, and she was very grateful.
That's surprising, because I went to a grammar school. I believe it still exists in some form or other, either directly granted or direct aided or something like that, Cardinal Vaughan in West London. But that was a Catholic grammar school, so you could gain entry to that even though I didn't live in the catchment area, but I had to take the 11 plus to get in.
Yes, and it's still, I mean, put it like this, I think it would be fair to say that it's probably harder to get into than some other schools.
Yes.
I mean, it is a comprehensive school in the way that number 10 Downing Street is a terraced house in Central.
And we used to have, of course, Holland Park Comprehensive up the road, which was where all the trendy people went, and where all the trendy sort of actors and politicians sent their children.
Yeah, well, that was very close
to
where Tony Benn and his wife lived.
Yes.
Well. It's become quite trendy again. But the point is that the comprehensive experiment failed very rapidly, as educationally and socially. It didn't unite the country. It still led very strongly to class segregation, and the education results of it were bad. But instead of saying we've made a mistake, both the educational establishment and the political establishment have shoved this under the carpet. By their actions, you can see that they don't really believe in it. Left-wing people are constantly sending their children to schools of the Cardinal Vaughan type, which are technically comprehensive, but not really. The Tories either go private or they've learnt the same wangling thing. They all know the truth of it. And what baffles me is why, when education is such a vitally important subject,
it really is.
So many people at the tops of all three political parties won't talk about this or admit there's anything wrong.
Yeah.
Germany, in fact, all the German-speaking countries in Europe, I think, still have grammar schools.
Yeah.
And they are, I think, probably the most successful economically, socially, and every other way of the countries in Europe.
Yeah.
And the private education, except for fairly dim people, is pretty much unknown in Germany. There's no need for it. People expect good education from the state.
Well, I've always said if they did away with private schools in this country, the education system would improve overnight, because all the people who care about their kids' education would suddenly be involved in all the schools as opposed to just some of the schools.
Well, what do you classify as private education?
Anything you pay for.
I would classify private education you pay for by buying a house in an expensive catchment area. That's private education. You can't abolish that.
Well, yeah, well, you can abolish fee-paying schools.
Well, you can, but then they will establish themselves in Ireland or on the continent or in the Far East, and people will send their children to them. Only a totalitarian country could actually do this. And in fact, it's very interesting that Labour, which constantly mounts these tirades against fee-charging independent schools, which I don't approve of fee-charging independent schools. I think they're deeply unfair. Labour is constantly raging against them, but during long periods in power with big majorities, it's never done anything about them at all. Whereas what it did do...
Many of them have also sent their children to them.
What not so many as used to, but what Labour did do was destroy all the good state schools. Which is it's quite extraordinary. The rhetoric is always against private schools, but they never actually do anything about them. What they do, and the other thing is, you hear politicians constantly saying, what we need is more cooperation between the state sector and the private sector. We used to have things called direct grant schools, which were private day schools, which also took large numbers of people for no fees from state primaries. Those were fantastically successful schools and a very good example of cooperation. And what did Labour do? They abolished it. So whenever you hear a politician saying, I want more cooperation between private and state schools, say to them, well, why did you close down the only time you ever did this?
Yes, when they had the chance to make it happen, they didn't do it. And one of the problems, of course, in a lot of schools is the amount of drug use there is and how many students, if you want to call them that rather than pupils, who are under the age of 18, end up smoking marijuana. Suella Braverman has gone along with some of the suggestions from last week about making it a Class A drug and therefore curbing the use of it. Peter Hitchens has spoken an awful lot about marijuana and legalisation of it and Class A drug making of it. And, does this mean it's closer to actually happening if the Home Secretary says she wants to do it?
It may happen, but it's gesture. Already marijuana has been moved up and down to Class C, back up again to Class B. Technically, possession of marijuana carries a 5-year prison sentence and an unlimited fine.
Yeah.
I think you would have to scour through the records of all the courts in this country for many, many years to find anybody receiving anything remotely resembling that sentence, even for a fifth offence.
Yeah.
It simply is not prosecuted, and that is the problem with marijuana. Not that the classification is too high or too low, but it is not prosecuted. It's the police don't actually pay any attention to it, and you know as well as I do. On windless summer days in London, much of the city stinks of marijuana. You can see,
but not just London, pretty much anywhere you go.
People smoke. Yeah, not just London, as you rightly say, but it is, I think, like all the social problems of the country, worse here.
Yeah,
but you see it everywhere. And it is, if you see a police officer, which is, of course, it's much harder to see a police officer than it is to see a spliff in London these days. But if you see a police officer, he or she passing by will pay no attention to this.
No.
Even when the marijuana people hold their annual 20th of April demonstration in Hyde Park, they're pretty much left to get on with it. I think you'd probably blow it in the face of a police officer and not much would happen to you. That is the thing which needs to be done. And people say, this is impossible. But the truth is that it used to be done here until the early 70s, and it is still done in two highly civilized countries, namely Japan and South Korea, which continue to prosecute possession. Now, we do a lot of...
And do they have less of a problem as a result?
They do have less of a problem, I would say, as a result. It's hard to measure whether it's a result or not. And certainly Japan has had a drug problem, not, interestingly, with marijuana. The drug laws of Japan were instituted because they had a very bad amphetamine problem after the war, which they tried hard to stamp out.
Right.
And the laws now are applied against marijuana. Social disapproval of marijuana use is also still strong, partly because the law is still strong.
Right.
But generally the use is... I think people who went from this country to either of those countries might be rather surprised if they had a marijuana habit, to find out how much harder it was to pursue it there and how much more dangerous it was to pursue it here than there. I think most people with any sense wouldn't try it. So it can be done. And we're not talking here about those Asian countries which impose the death penalty for drugs. We're talking about law-governed parliamentary democracies with reasonable legal systems which nonetheless prosecute. So it could be done, but only if you get the police to do it. But the police, who are basically paramilitary social workers in uniform, are not interested in pursuing it. But here's this crazy thing. The law will still, to some extent, pursue the trafficking of drugs.
They do.
Now, how does this make sense? If the trafficking of drugs is presumably illegal and frowned on because the drugs themselves are bad, well, what is the point at which the badness of the drugs makes itself felt? When they're taken.
Yes.
It's not when they're handed. If they handed around inert and nobody ever swallowed or smoked them, they wouldn't do any harm, would they? So why is it the actual action of possessing them, which is the heart of the crime, and which also is the source of all the money which flows into the hands of all the all the cartels? If all that is the case, why is it the one part of the drug trade which is not pursued is possession? Mr. Big is actually the millions of selfish young men and women, and not so young in many cases, in Europe and America, who fund the cartels and the whole drugs trade with their pounds and euros and dollars. And nothing is done about them. They're treated as if they're victims.
Yeah, well, they are, because that's how they're looked upon. And it would seem as though almost if you're a user, it's apparently not your fault. You've somehow been put upon by these ghastly criminals, and they've made you into somebody who needs drugs. So you mustn't be punished for that.
Well, you need treatment as if you were ill. I find this particularly infuriating. If people choose to take drugs, they don't choose to be ill. If people who had cancer could choose to give up having cancer, I happen to think that they would do so.
Yes.
To claim that taking drugs is something you cannot stop and is an illness seems to me to be an insult.
Although, of course, there are also many
ill.
people who do take drugs who say they take drugs and they don't do them any harm and they use it recreationally and they're very happy with that.
Well, they say that, but of course, what we don't know in these cases is what they and their lives would have been like if they hadn't taken drugs.
Yeah.
And how much damage they've done. What we all know, I think, anybody who lives in this society and knows anybody, is what is called anecdotal evidence, particularly of young men whose lives have been ruined by the mental illness which seems to accompany the use of marijuana. I say seems to accompany because the connection between the drug and the mental illness has not been proven.
Yeah.
Mind you, causation is very hard to prove, but the correlation between marijuana use and mental illness is shockingly high.
Well, I think I said this the other day to you, that there was an interview with an American doctor recently over this same debate, who said that there was a very big increase, a spike even, in the number of cases of psychosis amongst young men in American hospitals in states where marijuana was legalized.
Well, it wouldn't be a surprise.
No.
The other thing is, there is one these days. Crime is so common in this country that most of it's not reported, and the local newspapers have become very weak.
Well, even that incident at Liverpool Street the other day, I mean, it was bumped down the pecking order of the news inside 2 hours.
This is the point. You see, there is one small subset of crime which is still very intensively reported, and it's rampage killings and terrorist attacks. And in that one small subset. And what I say is always distorted into something other than what I say. In that one small, closely studied subset, which interestingly includes the Uvalde shooting in Texas earlier this year, you will find a very, very large percentage of the culprits long-term marijuana users. In Uvalde, here's the fascinating thing. The New York Times sent a reporter
I remember this.
to Uvalde, and he or she, because they sent several, reported that the culprit was a user of marijuana after talking to a work colleague. They put it on their website, then they dropped it because the New York Times didn't feel it was
not relevant.
Well, the Mail on Sunday sent a reporter
Yes, I remember.
found the same person and absolutely established that the shooter was a marijuana user. Well, why is it that one has to go to these lengths? It seems to me to be a vitally important thing that we understand that there is a connection between this supposedly peaceful hippie drug and actually quite a lot of violence, and it's available, studyable with these crimes. What if we studied all violent crimes and checked the drug use of all violent criminals? What would we find?
Yeah, interesting. We haven't got long, a couple of minutes really to talk about laytest developments in Ukraine, Crimea specifically. Russia also upping the ante a little bit this morning, it would seem.
This is very serious. The Kerch Bridge was a vital national project for Russia, as was the Nord Stream pipeline. And attacks on them, I think, are attacks on what you might call national integrity. And I think it's taking the war to a new stage. Well, if you want that, then that's what you want. But I think that the horrible things that have been happening in various Ukrainian cities this morning suggest that it's not going to be much fun for an awful lot of innocent people.
Exactly right. Well, Peter, good to see you. We'll see you next week. This week for Liz Truss will be an interesting one, I suppose, but as we were saying earlier, all catastrophes kind of calmed down. We're back into a period of calm, it would seem, for a few days. Will you enjoy that?
I know, it's always that moment when the wagon train circles and it's very quiet that you need to worry. As they always used to say, it's too quiet just before the arrows started thudding into the wagons.
Nothing terrible.
I wouldn't relax if I were Liz Truss.
Nothing terrible has happened for days now. It seems extraordinary.
Don't say that.
But it is only Monday. We shall see. Peter, thank you very much.